Thank you all so much for coming today to this reception. We are delighted to have you here. We're delighted to have Professor Robert George with us today as our commencement speaker. So we will be going over in a little while to Miller Chapel for commencement. You're all invited. I hope you can all come and join us there. But we have a great opportunity now for the next little while to have a conversation with Professor George, and including some Q&A. And so let me introduce Professor George. Professor George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. He grew up in West Virginia, went to undergrad at Swarthmore, and then studied law and theology at Harvard, and did his Doctor of Philosophy of Law at Oxford. Then he came to Princeton, and he's been at Princeton ever since. Professor George has served in many government roles. He's been a fellow on the Supreme Court. He's been on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's been the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He has written many books, Conscience and Its Enemies, Clash of Orthodoxies being two of many of them. And Professor George is a thought leader among thought leaders. For many, many years, he has been speaking about constitutional law and the intersection of constitutional law with public morality and ethics and conscience. And so we're thrilled to have him here with us today. Maybe if you could come up and join me here up on stage. Please welcome Professor George.
Thank you very much.
By way of further introduction, as we're thinking about our Wilberforce, our school, and what we're about, we chose William Wilberforce as the name of our school, as our namesake, because we are not a school that is modeled around a sort of monastic model or a Amish model. We're not separatists. We desire to cultivate mature adults who are well-formed intellectually and spiritually, and who we launch out into the world in various callings, and who are able to engage in the public square with the great issues of our day. And that is what William Wilberforce did so well. And so that's why we named the school after him. So as I was thinking about Professor George being with us, I was thinking about one of Wilberforce's probably most famous speech was in 1789. It was his speech that he laid out the case for the abolition of the slave trade. And I want to read you a few sentences from that speech, just to, again, by way of further introduction. This is Wilberforce at the House of Parliament. When I consider the magnitude of the subject I bring before the House, it's impossible not to feel terrified, and I'm shortening this a little bit. But after long and laborious study of this question, I march forward in the full assurance that my cause will bear me out, and that I shall be able to justify, upon the clearest principles, every resolution in my hand, the avowed end of which is the total abolition of the slave trade. I wish exceedingly in the outset to guard both myself and the House from entering into this subject with any sort of passion. It is not their passions I shall appeal to. I ask only for their cool and impartial reason. So in Wilberforce, you have a man of deep Christian faith and conviction who's motivated to take on some enormous issues that were controversial, that a lot of people didn't want to touch. And he took those issues on and went about public persuasion by an appeal to reason and evidence, and not just to his faith. And that description describes Professor George very well as well. He is a man of Christian faith and conviction, motivated to take up great issues, controversial issues that other people don't want to take up. And he is known for making his appeal based on reason and evidence. And so we're very happy and thrilled to have you here as someone who's carrying on in that tradition of Wilberforce. So the first question I wanted to ask Professor George is related to your biography. I guess a little over 100 years ago, your grandparents came over from Syria and Italy, settled in West Virginia. And at the time they came over, Woodrow Wilson was the McCormick Chair of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. Now, 2 generations later, you hold that chair. How did that happen?
Is this a great country or what? Well, I'll be happy to say just a word about that. But first, let me thank you, Hal, for the opportunity to be here. I'm very honored to be sharing in this joyous day of celebrating the achievements of the young men and women you are training up, and also the achievements of the Wilberforce School. It's so wonderful that we have this school in our community, and I just want to see it growing bigger and better and flourishing. And thank you for all the work that you do and all the work that the teachers, I know some of you are here in the audience, my beloved friend Janet Madigan's here, and so many others, parents, grandparents are doing to make this happen in our community. It is such a blessing to Princeton to have you here. And I am especially honored, deeply humbled, he's going to hate me for this, but I want to say it, to be in the presence of a true hero, an inspiration to me, my Wilberforce, which is Congressman Frank Wolf, someone I have admired enormously for my entire adult life. He has been such an inspiration. Frank? As Hal mentioned, I had the privilege and honor of chairing the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, on which I served for 4 years. I served 2 terms as chairman. And that commission was the fruit of Congressman Wolf's labors in Congress on behalf of religious freedom. It was only a small bit of his total work on behalf of religious freedom, work that took him in acts of enormous courage to some of the most dangerous places on earth to stand with the persecuted and with prisoners of conscience. But it's nevertheless an important part of Frank's contribution to our public life, and the commission is really a living testament to it. It's currently being chaired by my former graduate student, Daniel Mark, and I know that he draws inspiration from Frank just as I did and as I continue to do, and that commission will continue to do its important work, and for as long as it does, as long as it stands for the persecuted people and with the persecuted people of all faiths, by the way, of all faiths, and shades of belief, even those who don't share religious belief but are being persecuted for their convictions. And as long as that commission stands with prisoners of conscience, whether we're talking about in Iran or North Korea or in Cuba or in Venezuela, as long as it does that, it's going to be bearing witness to Frank Wolf. Well, you asked me that question about my own biography, and my little joke, is this a great country or what, is not just a joke. That's the answer to the question. I don't know whether we need to make America great again. I'll prescind from that debate. But America is great, and America is great because what happened in my life is not the exception. It's the rule. My story, the story of immigrant grandparents coming over with nothing, absolutely not on either side, with absolutely nothing, and working hard and taking advantage of the liberty and opportunity that we have in our country, making possible a materially better life for their children, educational opportunities for their children and then for their grandchildren. My story is your story. Probably everybody in this room can tell a story like that. If it's not a grandparent, it's a great-grandparent or a great-great-grandparent. But America at her best is America that is true to her founding principles. And those principles have nothing to do with identity based on blood and soil or race or on throne and altar. America at her best is the America of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's on the basis of that declaration, those principles, that America is exceptional. And it's exceptional because anybody can become an American. It's not based on race, it's not based on blood, it's not based on soil. It's based on your willingness to sign on to those principles and live by those principles. And we have learned that when we're true to those principles, the blessings abound for everyone. The opportunity not only lifts up individuals and their families, it elevates and ennobles, materially and spiritually enriches the entire community. When we've gone wrong, it's never been because, as a nation, as a people, as a culture, it's never been because we've been too faithful to our principles. It's always because we've been unfaithful, beginning with the original sin of slavery. The original sin of slavery. The exception to the rule that I was just talking about, people coming from other countries, or those who were brought here in that system of slavery that Wilberforce was so instrumental in destroying eventually, who did not come of their own free will and who were denied human rights, basic rights, even as we proclaimed those rights in our Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, for whom we should have esteem, who wrote those words that I quoted a moment ago, that we all know by heart from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Jefferson himself was a slaveholder. Never manumitted his slaves, never gave them up. Even Washington manumitted his slaves in his will and made financial provision for them because he knew he would be sending them into a difficult situation with their freedom. But Jefferson did not. Although Jefferson himself knew that the system in which he participated as a slaveholder was wrong. It was Jefferson who, speaking of slavery, said, "I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever." That was Jefferson. But he couldn't free himself from it. We were stuck in that original sin, and eventually we paid a very high price. Professor McPherson, my wonderful colleague at Princeton in American Civil War history, tells me that that price was 750,000 men dead on the two sides of the Civil War. That's the price we paid eventually for that original sin of slavery, and we continue in many ways to pay the price of that injustice. But the key thing to see is that even in the slave system, we were not acting on our principles, we were violating our principles. We had enunciated the correct principles, but hadn't lived by them. And when we live by them, that's when it becomes true to say that in this land of opportunity, anybody can be anything. Anybody can shoot for their dreams, and we should. There's nobody who's held back because of their race or their social class or their ethnic identity or anything like that. And I'm the living proof of that. And many of you, probably in some ways, all of you, are the living proof of that. And I'll close on this question, Hal, just by saying it's up to us, I believe, to ensure that this is not the last generation for which that's true. Each generation needs to make sure that the successor generation has the same freedom and opportunity. And that in turn depends on each generation being faithful to those fundamental founding principles that made America and make America great.
Related to that, how do you think we're failing, and how can we do a better job of passing on those fundamental principles to successive generations as well as people that are coming into the country as your grandparents did?
We're, in general, doing a terrible job of transmitting to our young people an understanding of the principles and values and virtues that are necessary for a free people to survive as a free people. We're failing to communicate to our young people a sound conception of freedom that is to be distinguished from license or simply doing what you want, when you want, with whomever you want, with no accountability. We are failing to teach our young people that there are conditions of liberty, moral conditions of liberty that need to be in place if liberty can be enjoyed and enjoyed without a society descending into moral chaos. We are leaving people, with young people especially, with the impression that you can do away with any reference to a transcendent source of meaning and value, of rights and obligations, and still have a free society. None of that is true. I mean, if you want a free society, if you want free institutions, if you want the liberty and opportunity we've historically enjoyed in the United States, people had better understand the concept of God-given natural rights. They had better understand that our rights don't come from kings or parliaments or presidents or congresses, but come from a more than merely human source of value and of obligation. And because our basic rights and duties don't come from any merely human power, they can be taken away by no merely human power. No merely human power can take our rights from us legitimately. No merely human power can relieve us of our moral obligations. But so many of our young people today don't understand it, and it's not their fault. It's our fault. Our colleges and universities, our high schools, our grade schools, in our homes, we fail to teach our students those fundamental truths. What's the solution? Christian classical education. It's a big part of the solution, because you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I certainly have an impression that people choose to send their kids to a school like the Wilberforce School, not because they think that's the best path to Harvard or Princeton, but because they know that the school will reinforce the lessons that they are getting at home about the relationship between freedom and faith, between liberty and virtue. And to the extent that schools like Wilberforce assist parents by reinforcing and enriching our young people's understanding of that, they are doing a tremendous service not only to those students and parents, but to the whole society. Because there's no way we keep this ship afloat. There's no way a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal is going to survive as such with a fundamentally miseducated people. Madison said only an educated people can be permanently a free people, and he was absolutely right about that.
I will actually, in the valedictory address, I happen to have seen a copy, and it will address some of those issues. I do have a question for you. Actually, I'd love to hear about some positive developments in that area, and I think that the James Madison program is one of those. The development of new institutions like Wilberforce or James Madison program, and it seems like that some people who gave up on the university and no longer wanted to support those financially and so forth have found an outlet in James Madison program and other programs like it in the country. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, some encouraging developments.
Yes. I forget who said it, but it's true that I think maybe it was T.S. Eliot who said it. There are no permanent defeats because there are no permanent victories. That is definitely true. And what it means is that in this vale of tears, in this world in which we human beings live and move and have our being, anything valuable that we have achieved and gained and put into place will be vulnerable to erosion and decay over time, and with negative forces bearing upon it. We humans are original sinners. We're not, once we've got something good in place, it's not there henceforth and forevermore. There's always the danger and the reality of decline. And that means there is always the need in each generation for renewal. As a Catholic, I probably shouldn't say this, but for reformation. to.
It's safe here.
Yeah, it's safe here. Yeah. You won't tell Monsignor Rosie down at St. Paul's.
You're good.
Quiet, Maria, between you and me. But we need renewal. We need renewal. This isn't the first generation that's needed renewal. This is a constant in human history, and in the church, and in our nation, and in Western civilization. There's always a need for renewal. And that means there need to be people who are renewing our institutions when they decay, fall into disrepair. And where we're operating on sound religious and moral and political principles, the task should be a little easier because we can repair to our first principles. We're not like the French revolutionaries who think that they've got to come up with a whole new set of principles never before considered in human history. Well, you see what came of that. Lots of heads being lopped off and bloodshed in the terror. Now, we're not in that position. We're in a much happier position because we've got sound principles of faith, sound principles of ethics, sound principles of politics. And we need to repair to those for renewal. The Christian classical school movement is part of that, as I see it. It's part of that repairing to first principles to repair what has been corrupted in education. We're trying to do the same thing at the university level with the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton. I conceived the possibility and need for such a program in the 1990s, and in 1999, when I had the great honor of being installed in the chair that you mentioned, the McCormick Professorship of Jurisprudence, I saw an opportunity to raise a bit of money from friendly foundations and individuals to propose to Princeton that we create a program that was unapologetically devoted to enriching students' appreciation and understanding of our founding principles, not merely the principles of the Constitution, but those plus the deeper principles of morality and religion that made the Constitution possible. The Constitution didn't come out of thin air. There's a whole tradition of thought about human nature, about the human good, about human value, about human destiny that had to be in place for us to get our Constitution. And to the very great credit of the administration of President Harold Shapiro, with Provost Jeremiah Ostreicher, they approved the creation of the Madison program, and we went into business in the millennial year of 2000. July 4th, 2000, we were up and running. So we've been at it now for 18 years. And we have vindicated the old real estate developers line, if you build it, they will come. We built it, and the students have come. And there's it turns out, a tremendous appetite, a tremendous desire for learning about fundamental principles of morality and politics and the Constitution among our students. Not 100%. I mean, there are some who are convinced that there's no truth, or that religion is a terrible thing, or that America is a horrible place. I mean, I don't give up on anybody, but they're not all beating down the door. And not all members of the faculty are enthusiastic about the work of the Madison program, but they have resigned themselves to it. We're here. We may be a bit queer, but we're staying. We're staying right here. We're not going anywhere. We're getting bigger and stronger than ever, as I think you know how. We have new activities, including a new certificate program for our undergraduates in American Ideals and Institutions. We sponsor courses, we host conferences, we have several different visiting lecturer series. It's just been a hugely successful enterprise, and so successful that it's being mimicked, and there are institutions at colleges and universities around the country and in Britain, at both Oxford and Cambridge, based on it. A lot of the credit for that goes to someone who's here, Luis Tellez, who's president of the Witherspoon Institute, and also the president of the Foundation for Excellence in Higher Education, which is devoted to creating programs modeled on the Madison program. Not all of them in this particular field of constitutional law and political philosophy, but in various areas of Western thought, at institutions around the country. We've got them at Harvard. There's one at Yale, at Stanford, University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, 2 institutes at the University of Pennsylvania. And that's part of that work of renewal, of which the school represents the manifestation at the K-12 level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, we really appreciate that work, and we've gotten to know many of the fellows that have come through. Some of them send their children to Wilberforce while they're here, and they're wonderful people, and it's enriched this community in many ways. So we're thankful for it. I do want to give an opportunity for people here to ask questions. I could keep going, but if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and I'll repeat it into the microphone. There in the back.
Could you tell us or share a little bit about your experience of touring with Professor Cornel West on what's reception?
So the question was, share about your experience touring with Cornel West and the reception you received.
I love to talk about this. I've been at Princeton for 33 years, 33 wonderful years. I am out of step, as you know, with the dominant political and religious views on campus, and yet I have never been a victim of persecution. Now I know other people at other institutions who have been. The idea that religious or political conservatives are a persecuted minority in American higher education is true. I can give you plenty of examples of that. But it's not true at Princeton, and it's certainly not been true in my experience. Princeton has been a very happy home for me. I've been able to teach my courses, the courses I want to teach, the way I teach them. Nobody tells me what I can or can't say. I have never been retaliated against in any way for anything that I have written or said or what I teach or how I teach it. Quite the contrary, the university has showered every honor that it has available to it on me, for which I'm enormously grateful. I've had countless wonderful experiences at Princeton, but my very best experience has been teaching with Brother Cornel West. Now, Brother West and I do not see everything the same. Now, we share a deep Christian faith. That gives us a bond. It really does. I don't know if it would be the same if that weren't there, frankly. But you get very far beyond that into the domain of politics and some important moral questions. Brother West and I go down different paths. But we've learned by listening to each other that we can learn from each other. And I know I speak for Cornel as well as myself in saying how grateful I am for the opportunity of the two of us to interact in a way that has enabled a kind of sustained learning to take place. It all began in 2007 when we taught our first seminar together. A seminar that was based on 12 books. Princeton has a 12-week semester. We read one book for each week and discussed it with it was a freshman seminar with our 18 wonderful, brilliant freshmen. No secondary sources allowed. We didn't want students reading about what Plato said. We wanted them reading Plato. We didn't want them reading about what St. Augustine said in the Confessions. We wanted them reading St. Augustine and engaging with these greatest minds of history. And we fell into a pattern of both commenting on the reading and then going back and forth between each other for another half hour or so of the 3-hour seminar, and then opening it for discussion, which has been our method of teaching really ever since. And we've taught now quite a number of times together, in addition to going around the country and doing public dialogues in universities and other places around the country. And you know, we have taught Sophocles' Antigone, as I say, St. Augustine's Confessions. We always include a dialogue or 2 or 3 from Plato. We try to make them works that have been important in our own intellectual and spiritual journeys in life. I had never read Luther's Babylonian Captivity of the Church. They didn't tell us about that in Sunday school.
I bet they didn't.
But it was an important work for Cornel, who's a Baptist, It was in connection with our teaching together because he had recommended. We had each chose initially. We each chose 6 books. We've left that behind more recently because we're now thinking so much together that we don't have to operate separately. We just jointly choose the books over lunch. But he recommended Babylonian Captivity of the Church, which, if you haven't read it, is a really remarkable thing to read. I don't say this pejoratively. It's just the most brilliant polemic I have ever encountered, and it made me see something that had really puzzled me. It helped me to understand something that really puzzled me. I mean, how could one guy, printing press or no printing press, how could one guy, obscure monk, cause such an upheaval and ultimately the division, the rending of Christendom, of Western Christianity? How could that happen? Well, the power of Luther is on full display in this work, this polemical work, the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And I could see how if you unleash that on the broad Christian public, something's going to happen. And for better and for worse, it did. And part, as you know, I think how part of my own mission in life, I have several missions that I have taken on. One of mine is Christian unity. It's a really important thing for me. I've been very active in the Evangelicals and Catholics Together movement. And toward that work, I think it's really quite a blessing that Cornell and I have worked together, that he introduced me to the radical, what he calls the radical Reformation, as exemplified, for example, in Luther's work. But Cornell and I do more than simply show that two people who disagree can be civil to each other. Too often our work together is presented that way. So we'll go to some university somewhere, and someone will introduce us by saying, you know, we wanted Professor West and Professor George to come because we think it's just so wonderful that they're two people who disagree who can be civil to each other. Well, you know, if that's the best we could do, I suppose it'd be worth doing. But you know, what we really want to show is that you can learn from each other. You can listen to each other. You can not just hear each other and politely tolerate each other. And first I talk and then you talk, but no one actually listens. All you do is hear. No, I mean, we learn from each other. We challenge each other. We make each other think. I mean, there are in our conversations, there's a lot of talk, but occasionally there's a real pause where we're both kind of just trying to think it through together. And I think those pauses really reflect the depth of what's going on. And the opportunity to share that with our students is much more important than simply the opportunity to model civility. Now, as I say, if that's all we could do, I'd still be for doing it, because we've got a tremendous, dangerous problem of incivility now in our society and in our universities. It's really bad. And it's not just bad, it's dangerous. It could be the unraveling of our educational system and of our society. So we do need that civility. But we need really something much deeper than that, and that is a kind of fellowship. A fellowship that is based on a common desire and willingness to pursue truth together, even if we disagree, not to see ourselves as adversaries, but rather as united, despite our disagreement, in a common mission of trying to get to the truth of these things. The method is what the philosophers call dialectical, that is the method of argument, agreement, disagreement, but still it's not adversarial in the sense that we treat our interlocutor as an enemy. It's not an enemy. Cornell's not my enemy. It's my brother. I love him. I know he loves me. He's not somebody I'm trying to destroy or humiliate or defeat in an argument. We're trying to get at the truth. And that bond of truth-seeking is much more powerful than the admittedly profound issues in some cases that divide us.
Another question?
I hear a lot of what you're talking about and writing about as providing a certain kind of foundation or support for Christian faith, or at least a theistic worldview. Do you view that as part of your personal mission
Yes, I do. My fundamental philosophical work has been in the tradition that's known as natural law theorizing. We Christians believe that St. Paul in the letter to the Romans is talking about the natural law when he refers to the law that's written on the heart, even of the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses, but can still understand right and wrong well enough to be held accountable and even judged ultimately by God on that basis. So I'm interested as a philosopher in ascertaining what can be known by natural, that is unaided reason even apart from revelation. And I think that's important not only in order to conduct business in a religiously pluralistic society where not everyone accepts, say, the authority of the Bible, but I think it's also very important as being part of a larger intellectual effort that's needed, certainly from a Christian point of view, to understand all that we need to understand about our moral obligations. We cannot look up the answer to the question of whether we should permit human cloning in the Bible. If we're going to get to the correct answer to that, yes, we're going to have to apply biblical principles. But philosophy is going to play a very important role in that. In fact, philosophy is indispensable to the enterprise of even understanding what the Bible is teaching us. The best example of that is to look at what the Bible says about marriage in Genesis 2, that the man shall leave his mother and home and cleave unto his wife, and the two will be one flesh. We might be tempted, as many have in the history of Christianity, to understand, I would say misunderstand, that concept of marriage as a one flesh union as a mere metaphor. The Bible doesn't mean it as a metaphor. I'll leave it to you to decide the general question of biblical literalism, but on that point, I have no doubt that the Bible means it literally. But then we're left with the question, how can two separate human beings, a man and woman, become one flesh, one biological unit? A little philosophical reflection actually does show us how that can be and indeed is the case. I with two of my wonderful former students, Ryan Anderson and Sharif Girgis, I've written a book called What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense, which is a natural law account of marriage corresponding directly to the biblical teaching in Genesis 2, but where philosophy is not being dictated to by Scripture, but rather helping to disclose what Scripture is telling us. So I'm a strong believer that faith and reason are not separate, but they are, to use the wonderful metaphor of the late Pope John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. They're in a cooperative relation. We can't get by only with one or the other. Hal mentioned I grew up in West Virginia, so I've seen a few wounded birds in my life. If a bird's got one wing wounded, one wing out of commission, it doesn't matter how good that other wing is. He's just never going to get up off the ground. He's just going to go around in a circle on the ground. It takes both wings for the bird to arise, to ascend. And that's true of our pursuit of truth as well. Faith and reason are the two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. Now, if in fact there are truths in the moral domain, those truths themselves reflect the fact that we are not merely material creatures, that we are not simply atoms in motion. We're not simply neurons firing in a brain, that we are spiritual as well as physical creatures. We are a unity of body, mind, and spirit. Now, how can that be? Well, that can only be if there is a domain, if there's a realm that is beyond the merely material. That is, if human affairs cannot be accounted for purely in terms of efficient and material causes. There are formal and final causes of everything that we know and experience. And if that's true, then there's a transcendent source of meaning and value. So yes, in that sense, the work that I do in ethics, in natural law theory, is part of a larger, I'll accept the word, apologetic, on behalf of a theistic worldview, as the only plausible alternative to the implausible, utterly implausible belief that everything can be reduced to the material, to material and efficient causality.
I was struck by a news article, I think it was a few months back, where a Christian group, I think Harvard Faith in Action, was given a probation for, I think, an probation of 1 year, because they asked one of their leaders to resign because she dated a woman. And I was just interested in your perspective and counsel in terms of, as we grapple with our society and our world, do you have any comment or recommendation for a wise way to move forward winsomely, thoughtfully, but in an environment where obviously there's a very strong passion?
Sure. Did everyone hear the question? So Harvard University took disciplinary action against a Christian organization on campus because the Christian organization had among its rules a rule that leaders of the organization had to share the Christian faith, had to believe what Christianity teaches, including in Christian moral teachings, including that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, and that sex outside the marital bond is intrinsically sinful. Now, what does it tell us that Harvard took this action? It tells us that the Christian worldview is not the only worldview. There are other worldviews, but you knew that. Christianity used to be the worldview that shaped our culture. We often failed in respect to it, as necessarily by Christian principles we will from time to time. Although we're never actually licensed to do it, but Christians understand sinfulness. And we understand that our job is to do our best, and we'll fail, but then try again and fail better and try to make more progress. But Christianity no longer has that role. But that doesn't mean that no worldview does have that role of shaping our leading institutions, cultural, political, economic, and so forth. There's a competing worldview, one that might be called secular progressivism. And that is an ideology. It functions in the role, in the lives of people who believe in it like a religion, in the same way that the Christian worldview, Christianity itself, functions in the lives of people like ourselves as a religion. And that worldview is now the worldview of people, some of whom still say they're Christian, but they're not in a serious way. That's the worldview of people who are in the dominant position at most of the elite institutions of our society, including many churches, just to be perfectly, brutally candid with you. According to that worldview, the Christian teaching on marriage and sex is nothing more than bigotry that must be, let us not pretend that we don't understand this, that must be eradicated. Eradicated. Cannot be tolerated. It must be driven out. It must be marginalized. To be marginalized, it must be stigmatized. To be stigmatized, it must be punished. And Harvard is punishing it. Now, whoever said that being a faithful Christian or Christian organization was going to be easy? What did Jesus tell us about what we needed to do if we were going to be his disciples? Take up our cross and follow him. Jesus told us when we signed on to this deal that it was going to come with persecution. And that's what's happening at Harvard. And that's just one small, tiny, teeny example of countless examples that I can cite for you. All over the country, in institution after institution after institution, in law firms, in corporate businesses, in educational institutions, professional associations, you name it. So what do we do? What do we do? What's the answer? Fidelity, courage, a willingness to take up the cross. That means never, ever acquiescing, even to get ahead, even to retain one's social standing. I'm going to talk about this later in my remarks. And not only never acquiescing, refusing to go silent. Now that's the hard part. That's the hard part, because what we're tempted to do, Hal, is what this school is refusing to do. And that is to retreat to a corner somewhere where we can have our little club, our little Christian club, and support each other, and have our liturgy and our services and so forth, but without anybody paying attention to us, going back into the catacombs. Now, I'm not exactly sure what Rod Dreyer has in mind. I've tried to figure it out by the Benedict option. I'm not exactly sure. But if that's what it is, it's the wrong option. We're meant to be salt and light in the world. We're meant to proclaim the gospel in season and out of season. By the gospel, I mean the whole gospel, not simply what we usually think of as the gospel, but the whole message. The pro-life message, the pro-marriage message, the pro-family message, the pro-religious freedom message. We got to be like Frank Wolf. We got to be courageous. We have to be willing to pay the price. That's what it means, take up your cross and follow me. It seems to me one of the best proofs for Christianity. The reason I think it absolutely must be true is that the demands it makes are absolutely impossible. And let me think about another dimension of that, or invite you to think with me about another dimension of that. Picture yourself as the 11 after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And they're huddled up in the room and they're afraid. But Jesus comes to them. Thomas didn't happen to be there that day, but he comes back so Thomas can get taken care of. And he promises he's going to send them this empowering spirit that'll enable them to go out and make disciples of all nations, that enable them to fulfill the Great Commission. Now, you can almost picture some of those guys, those Galilean fishermen. They didn't have great educations or anything like that. But they're told by the boss, by Jesus, here's the message. We want you to go out, and we've got this thing, this gospel, and we want you to go out there and make those disciples. We've got a great product here, and we want you to sell it. And they say, okay, all right, yeah, we're enthusiastic. Yeah, we're with you, Lord. You're resurrected. You've conquered death. Okay, now what do we tell them they get in return for signing on with this gospel? They're going to get rich. They're going to get famous. They're going to be powerful. They're going to be celebrities. What comes with it? Oh, by being our disciples, they get persecuted. They get to bear a cross. That's going to be your story. If you want to be my disciple, you want to be Jesus' disciple, take up your cross and follow him. Can you imagine being told that's your product to sell? And what's their response? Their response is, no way that message is going to be sold. Once that empowering spirit comes upon them at Pentecost, they're able to go out with that message and make disciples of all nations, to carry that message forward. Humanly, I have to believe that's impossible. If God wasn't in this thing, that just couldn't be done. They didn't have any conquering armies. They couldn't offer people the kind of thing that people naturally want: wealth, power, prestige, fame, glory. None of that was available to them. Not a Galilean fishermen have anything. And yet, they were able to proclaim that message and make disciples. It's amazing. I can't believe that's not true.
One more question. Charlie.
So you talk about truth. You talk about how Professor West try and dialogue and get to this truth. And I know it's something I'm interested in. I know it's something that the graduates are interested in. The Wilberforce community and the love and support. The Wilberforce community are interested in faculty, truth, and searching after these things. How would you gauge the student body at Princeton in being interested in searching for truth and around other college campuses? And how do we improve that level of interest? How do we get people to want to ask these questions and search for truth?
Well, very good. As I said earlier, I learned that when you build it, they will come. There's an appetite, there's a hunger among young people, not all, but many more than people imagine who are and from all different, that's what amazes me. If you look at the kids in the Madison program, they're not all from families who sent their kids to Christian classical schools. Different religions, some from completely secular backgrounds, all sorts of different characters, races, ethnicities, everything. But somewhere in them is this desire, this truth-seeking impulse. And so we put it out there for them, and they find that it's attractive. It has a kind of appeal to them. And it's not because the Madison program is fashionable or it's a fad or anything like that. I have tried to make it cool to be conservative at Princeton. I've succumbed to that. But there are more than you would think. Now, what are we up against? We're up against two big challenges. One is perennial. It goes all the way back. You'll find it in human history where no matter where you are, no matter when you're talking about, we go all the way back to Plato's Athens, Socrates, you're going to find it. And that is this. People do have a kind of instinctive desire to know the truth, but it competes with other desires for wealth, for fame, for glory, for prestige, for social status. And truth doesn't always win that competition. There are alternatives that lure people away from truth-seeking. And sometimes people don't want to know the truth because knowing the truth means giving up things people don't want to give up. Remember that story in St. Mark's Gospel about the rich young man? Some translations have it as the rich young ruler who encounters Jesus. He's coming looking for Jesus. I picture him arrayed in a magnificent gown, kind of like what we'll be wearing today, maybe. With his great retinue. There'll be camels and dromedaries and servants and chests of jewels and things like that. But he's a good person. He's a good person. And he seeks out Jesus and says, Master, good master, he says, good master, what do I need to do to merit eternal life? And remember Jesus' first response to him. He says, why do you call me good? God alone is good. And then he doesn't wait for an answer to the question why. He just launches into his next line, which I've always interpreted as Jesus actually making the point that he is in fact God. Why do you call me good? God alone is good. This fellow is so insightful, this rich young man, this rich young ruler, that he has implicitly recognized the divine in Jesus. Pretty cool, huh? I mean, not a lot of people could do that. Especially not a lot of rich people who are distracted with worldly things. But he did. This is a serious man, this rich young ruler. He's not some frivolous celebrity or playboy rich kid. He's serious when he says, Jesus, what must I do to inherit it? Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus' first response, do you remember? Well, you know the commandments. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, honor your father and your mother. And this guy is able, this rich young man is able to look the second person of the Blessed Trinity in the eye and say to him, I can never say this, but Think of how few people could say. He says to him, Master, I have kept them from my youth. He must have thought, yeah. Jesus, ask Jesus the question, what do I need to do? He says, here's what you need to do, and I've been doing it. I'm golden. What's St. Mark tell us next? Jesus then looked at him with love. With love. He's about to deliver the hardest teaching, a teaching that's going to be devastating. Why is he doing it? Because he loves him. And because he loves him, he doesn't want him merely to be good. He wants him to be perfect. So Jesus looked at him with love and said, well, then there's one more thing you must do. Go, sell what you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me. Do you remember what happens? The young man turned his face away sad and left because he had many possessions. That's what the gospel tells us. He couldn't get himself over the line because there were things that he was tied to. Not bad things, not immorality. He didn't want to go, off with lots of women or oppress people or gamble or drink. That wasn't what, he just wanted to live his comfortable life. But Jesus said, no, I want you to be perfect. You got to sell what you have and come. Now, anybody who thinks that story is just about material possessions is off base. Happened to be material possessions in that man's case. But all the gospel stories are for all of us, not just for the people they seem to be directed at or the class of people they seem to be directed at. And all of us have many possessions. There are things we don't want to give up. And for so many young people, it's social standing, it's prestige, it's status, it's celebrity, it's wealth. It's all of those sorts of things that compete with the desire to know the truth. So that's number one, and that's perennial. It's a big challenge. That's a challenge for any evangelist, any teacher, any rabbi, in any time. It was a challenge for Jesus himself, as that story indicates. But we have a second challenge, and this one's distinctive. And that is that there is a powerful, super powerful, competing ideology that has control of the communication, the media of communications, the news media, the entertainment media, the elite institutions, the colleges, the universities, in many cases the schools, the professional associations, the corporate world, and that's progressive or secular progressivism. That's the ideology of secular progressivism. And many of our young people come to Princeton or any other university today already fully indoctrinated in the dogmas of secular progressivism. They believe those dogmas with the passion that an enthusiastic and devout Christian believes the dogmas of Christianity, the Trinitarian nature of God, the incarnation of Jesus, you name it, the ascension of Jesus bodily into heaven. They believe their dogmas, like there's a right side and a wrong side of history, that sexual fulfillment is a really important thing, and it can be achieved in many, many different ways, and marriage is just one possible way, but it's not the only possible. And there are all sorts of other dogmas that they believe with that kind of intensity. So when someone like me, someone actually raises, as teachers are really bound to do, a question about that, when I challenge, or any of my colleagues challenge their fundamental beliefs, they often perceive that as a kind of assault on them, because these are cherished, deep, identity-forming beliefs. They're matters of faith. They help to define who they are. And if a professor says, well, why do you believe that? Or have you considered the counter-argument? It's like a challenge to their very sense of self, to their identity. So our students are not coming in as tabula rasas, as blank slates. And they're certainly not coming in as moral relativists. Sometimes people think that. That's not our problem. I almost long for the days when students were moral relativists. The trouble today is not that they're moral relativists, it's they're ferocious moral absolutists. They just got the wrong absolutes. They're absolute about them. There are things that are absolutely right and wrong in their view, and that they're willing to die for, and I fear sometimes willing to kill for. But they are not the right things. They're certainly willing to subject other people to even civil and professional punishments or disabilities for them. So the baker who declines to bake a cake for a same-sex celebration, they're prepared to drive that guy out of business or subject him to a fine or send him to jail because of their deep absolutist faith that people have a right to any kind of sex that they want to have or any kind of relationship that they want to have. And that baker had better bow down before it, had better honor it, or else he's got to be punished. So that's our problem. There's the perennial problem and then the one that's very specific to us. But you know what? We got a wonderful message. But a wonderful message because it's truth. And it's true. And truth still has a kind of luminosity. John Paul II had a great encyclical called Veritatis Splendor. Papal encyclicals are letters that popes write to the faithful about important issues. And Veritatis Splendor means the splendor of truth. And it's that splendor that has within it somehow a deep appeal to people. Sometimes you have to push the stuff that's blocking the vision of the truth out of the way. But if you can get people to think about it, if you can get people to put some of these beliefs that are blocking their understanding of the truth onto the table for critical scrutiny, then the truth will begin to shine through and they'll see it and they do find it appealing. They do find it attractive. We have to remember that truth is not just propositions, that as Christians we believe truth is a person. So behind those propositions, the more you know the truth, the more you are open to the person who identified himself to us as the way, the truth, and the life.
Thank you so very much. We have a little gift for you. I'm glad you mentioned Rod Dreher, the Benedict option. I think there's a better option, the Clapham option. And William Wilberforce was, in his campaign to abolish the slave trade, was a part of a group of people, wasn't a lone actor, and a lot of them lived together around Clapham Common, just south of London. And they were prominent people of different walks of life, but several of them lived together, and they linked arms together in the campaign to abolish the slave trade, as well as countless other efforts, including child labor law reform, penal reform. They started the Humane Society, International Bible Society. They were involved in great efforts for the public good together. And one of the things that they did in the campaign to abolish the slave trade, they recruited Josiah Wedgwood the potter, to make an image of a kneeling slave and put it on snuff box tops and hairpins and on plates. And
Am I not a man?
Am I not a man and a brother is the campaign, the slogan underneath. And really, I can't verify it, but it was one of the first, if not the absolute first, sort of campaign button that they created. So we've recreated that here, this plate with the kneeling slave, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And we would love, you're part of our Clapham group by being here with us and linking arms with us today, and we would love to share that with you. It's time for us to move over to the commencement ceremony. Please join us over there, and we'll see you there.